You're late, but that's okay. Great. Great to be back on Wednesday nights. As we were just commenting, we've only had 2 before tonight this year due to either my absence or weather. So glad to be back and continuing the Gospel of Matthew. At first I thought, gosh, how am I going to fill, when we get to May and June? But I don't think that's going to be the problem I thought it was going to be with this soft start that we've had to 2025 on our Wednesday night Bible studies. But for those of us who have forgotten where we were in the Gospel of Matthew, and we had just gotten through the story of the Magi and Jesus' flight to Egypt, the Rachel weeping for her children in Bethlehem, the slaughter of the innocents by Herod. And like most of the Gospels, you get a time jump. You move forward in time. So it's interesting because it seems that every Gospel starts a little bit earlier, because Mark starts with Jesus as an adult. Matthew starts with Jesus as a child. We don't get the story of the birth. We just get him in the house with the Magi. Luke, we actually get the story of the birth in Bethlehem. And then John, we get in the beginning was the Word. We just go all the way back to the beginning of time on John. So everything sort of backs it up a little bit. Following that, chapter 2, Jesus is baptized. Now the baptism story, the John the Baptist story, almost identical to what you find in the Gospel of Mark. John the Baptist was a huge figure in the first century. His influence was widespread, he was well known, and there's no way you could really tell the gospel story in Palestine without dealing with John the Baptist in some way. He had reputation that went far beyond. In fact, Paul talks about encountering a follower of John the Baptist when he gets to Corinth in Greece. So, I mean, it was a widespread influence. So every gospel talks about John. In Matthew, Jesus is baptized by John, and then immediately after that baptism goes into the wilderness. And so that's what we're going to pick up tonight is the temptations, because that's something Matthew does a little bit different. In Mark, we just read that Jesus went into the wilderness to be tempted. That's all we got. But we get a little more detail here in Matthew. The Spirit, this is chapter 4, verse 1. Then the Spirit led Jesus up into the wilderness so that the devil might tempt him. And after Jesus had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, he was starving. The tempter came to him and said, "Since you're God's son, command these stones to become bread." And Jesus replied, "It's written, people won't live only by bread, but by every word spoken by God." So refuting Satan with a quote from Deuteronomy here. We move on to the second temptation. After that, the devil brought him into the holy city and stood him on the highest point of the temple. And he said to him, "Since you're God's son, throw yourself down, for it's written, I will command my angels concerning you, and they will take you up in their hands so that you won't hit your foot on a stone." I'm really a little concerned that Satan quotes from the Psalms. Bothers me a little bit. I'm just going to go ahead and confess, particularly one of mine. This is Psalm 91, which was part of my dissertation. I did 90 to 106. So it's a little upsetting that Satan knows the Psalms so well, and it's one of mine. But anyway, but Jesus refutes that again from Deuteronomy. Jesus replied again, "It's written, don't test the Lord your God." And then we get the third temptation. The devil brought him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said, "I will give you all these if you bow down and worship me." And Jesus responded, "Go away, Satan, because it's written, you'll worship the Lord your God and serve only him." The devil left him, and angels came and took care of him. So a little bit of an expansion than we get in Mark, right? Mark we just got, and Jesus was tempted. Here we get the 3 different temptations: stoned to bread, throwing himself off the temple, in other words, showing off with his power, and then the last one, bowing down to Satan and getting the kingdoms of the world. So thoughts you have as we went through that real quick before I offer the thoughts I have. Yes, ma'am.
This may be totally irrelevant and but so he was tested in the wilderness.
Yes.
It sounds like he went to Jerusalem.
Yes.
Well,
Part of the wilderness testing was a drop-in in Jerusalem's temple. Yes.
was this just kind of a fantasy? So is it magical
It does. I mean, this is not uncommon. I mean, magical transportation is not uncommon. Obviously, I'm not saying magical, but yes. First of all, the desert wilderness is, miles away, not like tens of miles away. I mean, singular miles away. The Judean wilderness is just, It is 15 miles from Jerusalem to Jericho downhill, and you're in the middle of the desert in 3 miles pretty easily. So it's not like, I don't know how far in the Judean wilderness he goes. It doesn't have to be far to be away from everything. The other side of that is it wasn't uncommon in certain prophetic visions to have this kind of transport. I'm thinking of Ezekiel in particular, where in Ezekiel chapter 7 and 10, God picks Ezekiel up by his hair in Babylon and takes him to Jerusalem to see the temple. And so I'd never thought about the echoes of that, but there are some here, right? He takes him to the temple in Jerusalem. So only it's Satan doing it here. I wonder if there's anything we can talk about in that. I don't know. But yeah, there does seem part of this temptation in the wilderness is a brief stint in Jerusalem to show off with the power. Yeah. Yeah. Bob.
So then my overall question on this is whether your view is that this was these temptations were a one-time temptation, or does this reflect a life of temptation?
I think that it doesn't have to be an either or here. Yeah, Bob asked the question if this is a one-time, sort of once-for-all sort of temptation, getting it all out of the way, or is this reflective of temptation that Jesus is going to be seeing over time? I think I don't have any problem reading it both ways at the same time. And by that I mean, I don't have a problem thinking of this in a literal way, and I also don't have a problem thinking of this as, frankly, all 3 of these embodiments of temptations that are going to be faced by Jesus later on. The temptation to use power to self-serve, to use power to show off. I mean, to use power to show off is... he walks on the water, but he only does that for the disciples. He doesn't do it for the people, right? The people want to come and make him king after he feeds the 5,000 in the book of John, which would seem very much like the last temptation, right? Do things Satan's way as opposed to God's way. So I think that they very much embody the temptations Jesus is going to face throughout ministry, but I also don't have any problems reading these as a singular event as well. I think it's important that talking about them in the wilderness, particularly in Matthew, because it shows further connection to the people of Israel, just like his baptism does. Israel was tested in the wilderness, and so Jesus is tested in the wilderness. We get this whole new Moses thing. Jesus comes out of the wilderness successfully, where Moses did not. Significant that the ends don't justify the means in any of this. The means are an end. In other words, go ahead and use your power to make bread. Go ahead and bow down and get the kingdoms of the world. You can avoid that whole cross thing. Well, no. It actually matters how that is going to happen. You don't compromise and go Satan's route to accomplish God's tasks on this. That's not going to work. The means are an end. And this is what I said, the temptations do represent temptations Jesus is going to continue to face as he goes throughout. So yeah, obedience matters. Faithfulness matters. Okay. Following the temptations, we get the call of the disciples. Very similar story. We get Peter and Andrew. We get James and John in the fishing stories. And then, after the disciples are called, we get the Sermon on the Mount. This is chapter 5 through 7. It is the first of Jesus' discourses in the gospel. Remember, I told you in Matthew that there are 5 discourses, 5 moments where Jesus is teaching. The first one of these is the biggest. It's the Sermon on the Mount. It's a huge one. People have called it the manifesto of the kingdom of God. This is where Jesus tells you what it is to be a member of the kingdom. Now, the question is, when is what people will answer, because this is hard stuff, right? The Sermon on the Mount is full of incredibly challenging. Well, I mean, frankly, the point of the Sermon on the Mount is this is who God is, and this is who people in the kingdom of God are. They look like God. They are people who love their enemies and who turn the other cheek and who are faithful in all these ways. And it's, being like God is really, really hard. And so are all sorts of theological and mental gymnastics to find some way to keep us from having to be faithful to the Sermon on the Mount. People have gone to all sorts of really some very concerted effort to do this. So how literal is Jesus being here, right, in the Sermon on the Mount? Do we have to do this? Is there an interim ethic, right? An ethic that while we live in this world, before the kingdom is made manifest in this world, is there something that we can do in between time? Are we called to be, perfect right away, or can we be imperfect for a little bit and then maybe eventually we'll be perfect? Maybe all of this is here just to show how impossible it is to be like God, and that's why we need grace. So it's not about doing anything, it's just about showing how bad you people are. And see, look at that. You can't love your enemies. See how much you need Jesus? That's the whole point of the sermon, right? That's just to show you that. Some suggest it is the ethic of the kingdom, but eventually, right? Sooner or later, when God makes the kingdom manifest, then we'll be able to love our enemies and do all the things God calls us to. Or perhaps it is actually the ethic of the kingdom of God for the Christian community in the world today, that it is what we are called to do and be as we go through. And there are groups of people that take this very, very seriously. And when I say that, I mean there are denominations for whom this is the most important passage of Scripture. The Church of the Brethren is one that comes to mind for me. They are an Anabaptist Peace Church group, and if you ask a Church of the Brethren professor to teach Introduction to the New Testament, they're going to be in the Sermon on the Mount by Thanksgiving still. They wouldn't have gotten anywhere. This is the focus. Commentaries are written by their publishing houses on this. The focus is how we live like this in community. And so it is taken seriously by some, and of course by others sort of pushed aside because it's just too hard. It's just too hard to do. So I'm going to be honest, I think we probably need to be down here more than up here. Yes, Bob?
I'm thinking of the quote from the football coach,
Vince Lombardi.
Vince Lombardi. He said, "We know perfection is unattainable, but when we chase perfection, we can catch
excellence if we chase perfection."
And that's the ideal. That's what we should be
Right.
striving for. Even if we know we can't do it perfectly all the time.
Yeah, the one challenge there, and we'll get to this verse in a little bit, is that Jesus actually says, "Be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect."
But again, he's giving you the target.
He is, absolutely.
He doesn't expect us to be perfect.
Well, he just said
wants us to try.
but didn't he just say we should? You mean Jesus is telling us something we can't do?
We should be perfect.
There you go. Be perfect. No, he's saying be perfect, as though we can attain that, as though it's possible.
No, you don't have to interpret it that way. Who expects that?
Methodists will interpret it that way. I mean, no lie. I know I say Methodist. I mean John Wesley in particular. He felt that be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect was an imperative by Jesus, and that Jesus would not have told us that were it not possible, because Jesus wouldn't have given us an impossible task. He wouldn't have lied to us that way.
Well,
And so,
I'm just doing what you said.
I know.
But in my version, I'm acknowledging
Yeah.
it is as difficult as
It is.
seems.
It is absolutely as difficult as it
There's a
seems.
plan for us
Agreed.
to do it.
Yes, I agree.
If we could succeed in that, why would we need God and Jesus?
Well, that's Jesus, the one that makes that possible. So we couldn't do it apart from Jesus.
That's what I meant.
Yes, but we can do it then, because now we got Jesus. So, yes, I'm sorry, Nancy. I don't. What are we going to do? So, I don't think it's so impossible to show us the need for grace. I don't think we should simply discount the Sermon on the Mount because it's hard and we don't like it. And that, frankly, is the reason I see too many people discount it. It's hard and we don't like it. We don't want to love our enemies. That we don't want to turn the other cheek. We want to punch back when we get punched. I mean, it's just what we want. And so we don't want this. So Jesus is being, he's being figurative. No, I actually think he might actually be being literal here. He might actually say this is what the kingdom of God looks like. And so let's try that. Let's try being like the kingdom of God. So now we're going to see how impossible it is. Don't worry, we're not getting through all of it tonight. It's too good. We're going to take some time on this. Some translation issues you might want to know about. The word makarioi, happy or blessed, This is the beginning of the Beatitudes. Blessed is the one, or happy is the one, or it is the condition of your soul when it has received God's favor. So how you want to capture that sense. Blessed, I mean, the only problem with blessed, I think, is that too often we hear that materially, and that's not what it's trying to capture. It's trying to capture, in this case, a wholeness of soul, a shalom, if you will, a flourishing of person. And so blessed is probably good, but only if you're making sure you're not hearing that material blessing thing that we can sometimes put on that. Happy, maybe a little bit. It's tough to translate sometimes, right? I mean, this is a word that is difficult to translate elegantly because, like I say, it's the condition of your soul when it's found favor with God. So, fullness, wholeness, flourishing, shalom. The Hebrew word ashrei has a sense of being led correctly or set right, being where you're supposed to be kind of sense. So it's really an interesting word in Greek. And I just want to take a moment to remind ourselves of some of the translation challenges that you get in conveying a lot of this. So, got a couple more translation issues, but this is an important one. Please.
The condition of your soul when it has received God's favor.
Correct.
How does one know when the soul?
When your soul has received God's favor? How do you know when your soul has received God's favor? Well, I guess you're makarioi at that point. So, you know. I don't know. I don't know that it's probably one of those things. If you have to ask, then you haven't. Maybe that I think it's a question you would know when you're set right. And
I think you know more often when you look back.
Maybe. Margaret said she thinks you know more often when you look back, when you were right with God, when you have been received God's favor. Yeah. It's a good question. Another translation issue that I want to highlight is dikaiosune. Dikaiosune is justice or righteousness in Greek. Now, justice and righteousness in Hebrew are two separate words, in mishpat and tzedek in Hebrew. But in Greek, they only have this one word, dikaiosune, and it means both things. And the words justice and righteousness are really close in their definition, even in Hebrew. Because biblical justice is when society and the community is rightly acting to reflect God's priorities. It is a just society when it is reflecting God's priorities. Well, righteousness is when individuals and or society is demonstrating right motives and right actions. So you see the overlap there. I mean, righteousness does tend to be a little more individualistic, though it doesn't have to be, as sometimes society is talked about that way. Justice tends to be a little more social in that sense of when society is reflecting God's priorities and lifting up those that God cares for and looks that way. But the words basically, there is nuance in the meaning in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, both of those words are captured in the one word dikaiosune. So now comes the challenge of a translator. What do you pick when you're putting it in English? Right? When you can encounter this word in Greek, which way do you go? In 1611, they chose righteousness. Right? So blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and let your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. You could have easily gone with justice. You could have been blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice is a perfectly legitimate translation of Matthew 5:8. So it's one of those things I just want to remind you sometimes, because I think righteousness, because of that individual characteristic, can have a tendency to be spiritualized and maybe hyper-spiritualized and individualized, and you don't think about the society and community parts of these things. It's just me and my life and my righteous, when the word has within it some social concern. And I think that's worth mentioning. I have often wondered what history would look like if the King James had chosen justice instead of righteousness in that translation, if that would have affected things. I doubt that it would have. Because there's plenty of places the Bible talks about justice that we ignore anyway. We could have ignored another spot. Wouldn't have been that hard. Yeah. So.
Well, I'm pretty certain that justice has also been politicized in our lifetime.
And politicized?
To remind for any particular situation that they want rectified.
Oh, I see. So people would use the term injustice for anything that motivates themselves that they don't like.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think it's very loosely used now.
No? Oh, well, there's plenty of vocabulary that doesn't have a lot of meaning because people have used it for self. Yeah.
What is justice for this crime or that crime?
Yeah.
What is justice for the 9/11 victims? I mean,
Right.
I'm doing a project on that right now, so that's on my mind.
Sure.
What is justice for the Ukrainians?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It bounces all over. It bounces all over.
Yeah. And one of the challenges, and this is one that I have seen, yeah, and in addition to what you're talking about, Bob, and that is that the word being connected to the things that we care about, is sometimes I'm not even sure what God's justice looks like in particular situations. I mean, I don't know how to find that justice. I mean, I see an unjust situation, and I know it is unjust. I mean, I think about a Palestinian Christian family in 1948 whose home, they've been kicked out of their home, and now that home is a shopping mall in Tel Aviv. So what does justice look like for this fourth generation of this family that has been put away? And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know how to make a situation like that right. So, Bob?
Even right here at our church, we had to put a fence around the HVAC system
Right.
because people were coming and sleeping there.
Right.
It wasn't that they were sleeping.
Right.
They were leaving deeper and deeper piles
Of trash.
debris.
Yeah.
And it just made it unsafe for the equipment
Right.
to function.
So what is how to justly handle a situation of homelessness when there's so many systemic things that are working on that? Yeah, it's a tough word. It's a tough word. So I wonder what the Beatitudes would look like if we'd gone the other way. I don't know, but let us look at the Sermon on the Mount. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up a mountain. You probably have already picked this up. I mentioned at the very beginning when we started talking about Matthew. Mountains are very important in Matthew. You're going to see things happening on mountains a lot. We've already had the final temptation took place on a mountain. We have this first teaching come forth on a mountain. As we go through, Jesus is transfigured on a mountain. The apocalyptic teachings on a mountain. The very end of the text, he leads them up and gives go ye therefore into all the world from a mountain. Mountains, very big. And I think this is another one of those connections to Moses, right? This sort of teaching from Sinai kind of idea that as Moses got the law from Sinai, Jesus is teaching from the mountain here. But mountains, very, very important. The temple, very important in Luke, which is why Luke reverses the temptation order. So in Luke, the mountain temptation is the second one. The temple temptation is the third one, because in Luke, he's big on the temple. And we'll talk about that when we get to Luke. So yeah.
Culturally, what defines a mountain? Because when I think of mountain, it varies from hills.
Right. It depends on what part of the country you're from when you can talk about mountains, right? Yeah, I think what's interesting in Israel is the topography is so distinct. And as you go from the Mediterranean Sea at sea level and you get to Jerusalem, that's an increase in 40 miles, you go 2,200 feet above sea level. Then in the next 15, you drop about 6,000 feet. So you're down at 1,500 below sea level. And then you come back up again on the other side. And so that Rift Valley right there kind of demarcates a lot of mountains of rather significant height. I mean, we're talking a couple of thousand feet. I mean, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim and Mount Tabor, when you see them, you're like, oh, Mount Carmel, that's a mountain, So I feel like it was just that anything in stark contrast to the plains that are sitting right next to them is probably what they're thinking. Yeah. This is probably happening in the Galilee, which is where Jesus is teaching right about now.
So Jesus went up to the mountain.
Right.
The crowds go with him, or the crowds stay out?
No, the crowds go with him. Yeah. The traditional location of this is in the Galilee on the northern edge of the lake. There are some who suggest that Jesus was at the base of a natural amphitheater on this mountain area there at the northern part. But I mean, there's no way to know. There's just, that's a traditional location. So.
Is the Sermon on the Plain different? Or so they're not the same?
No, the Sermon on the Plain in Luke and the Sermon on the Mount, there's a lot of repeat, right? I mean, the love your enemies and turn the other cheek, and the blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the poor. There are plenty of scholars who say it was the same sermon. It was the same sermon, and they just have two different ways of expressing it. And I understand why they say that. There's another part of me that says, you know, which sermon did I say to be like Jesus? You know, I say that a lot, you know, in a lot of different contexts. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Jesus had some reused material depending on the location he was. I mean, yeah, maybe it's a greatest hits. It's a callback. No, but I don't have a problem with, and that's why I think you've heard me say in the sermon that Luke is emphasizing a different sermon. And because I do think of it that way. I think I think of it probably as an independent, discrete unit. Is it possible it's the same sermon that these adapted? Yeah, of course, but doesn't have to be. In 3 years of preaching, there's a good chance that some of this material gets repeated. I'm just speculating on that, but I think that Jesus wasn't coming up with something new every day. So I think some folks might need to hear the same speech again. Right. Didn't have the lectionaries, so free to repeat. And you know, most pastors will tell you that congregations at best have an 18-month memory. So if you want to repeat a sermon after 18 months, you're probably okay, unless it was really distinct. So, yeah. Okay, so that's about the mountain. I'll pick up the pace, I swear. He sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he taught them, saying, "Happy are people who are hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs." That's the Common English Bible's translation of poor in spirit. Hopeless. Not a bad translation. I kind of like that. Happy are people who grieve, because they'll be made glad. Happy are people who are humble, because they will inherit the earth. Happy are people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness or justice, because they will be fed until they are full. Happy are people who show mercy, because they will receive mercy. Happy are people who have pure hearts, because they will see God. Happy are people who make peace, because they will be called God's children. Happy are people whose lives are harassed because they are righteous, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are you when people insult you and harass you and speak all kinds of bad and false things about you, all because of me. Be full of joy and be glad, because you have a great reward in heaven. In the same way people harassed the prophets who came before you. So, much like Luke, we get some surprise text here. I mean, that sense of happy is the person who is harassed is not the typical way you think of these things. Humility is not, I mean, we have meek in most translations. Here, humble. Humility was not a virtue in the ancient Greek world. Aristotle believed that humility was dishonest. If you were humble, you weren't being honest about your skills. So it was not a virtue, it was lying to be humble. And so Jesus is already, you know, dealing against that Greco-Roman tradition in saying that, no, blessed are those who are humble. They're the ones who inherit the earth, not the boastful. This is a beautiful, poetic introduction to what comes next. I have often likened the Beatitudes to the Ten Commandments, because the Ten Commandments are sort of the first of those 613 laws that we get in the Old Testament. They offer 10 apodictic laws, absolute laws, that offer a broad statement of what it is to love God, what it is to love neighbor, and then we see, you know, no conditions, no punishments, no specific situations. But then, after those 10, we see all that worked out in specifics, right? How that happens. Here we have the Beatitudes, again, this poetic introduction that now we're about to see how all of this works itself out in community as we go. Yeah, Bob. Bob, you're frowning.
Yeah, I'm really troubled tonight by verses 11 and 12.
Ah.
Because I'm thinking of people that honestly believe they're representing Christ.
Right.
And other people are trying to tell them, you're getting it wrong.
Right.
Oh, this is the suffering that Jesus is telling me.
Right.
I'm blessed for this.
Right.
Because people are speaking bad about me.
Yeah. So Bob is concerned about the challenge of figuring out what is harassment because you're speaking the gospel and what is harassment because you're obnoxious. All right, what's the difference in those two things?
All because of me.
The all because of me is the key there. Yeah, you're exactly right. Are you representing Jesus well, and that's why you're being harassed?
But,
I know. They would argue they are.
right.
Right. Yes. Yes. So
They would argue they are.
the people that Bob is talking about who are being obnoxious believe they're actually representing Jesus well, and so
Westboro Baptist Church.
that I wasn't going to call names, but yes, Westboro Baptist Church is a good example.
Whoever's left.
Yeah.
Agree. They must feel so blessed going out there and having.
Look how much people hate us. We must be blessed. Yes. Yeah. It's a pretty small heaven though too. Just like the 12 of them is going to get there. So. So
I'm not sorry that it's there. It's just really challenging you.
it is. Well, I mean, it's always the challenge. When are we deluding ourselves, and when are we actually committed to Christ? Yes. When are we allowing? I mean, this is not a new problem, right? I mean, this Hananiah and Jeremiah in chapter 28 of Jeremiah. It's a great story where Jeremiah comes out and says, Babylon is going to exile us, and Hananiah walks in and goes, "That's true, but it's just going to be for 2 years." And Jeremiah goes, "Say that is good news," and leaves, right? And then God comes to Jeremiah and says, "I didn't tell him that. Get back in there." And he's like, "Dang it, I really thought that was good news." And he went in, and Hananiah ends up dying because Hananiah's name, by the way, means grace of the Lord. And so he was just sure that God would be gracious and we wouldn't actually have to deal with all this. And Jeremiah thought so too. And then God said, "No, get back in there. I didn't tell him that." So I mean, the ability that we have to conflate our will with God is remarkable. And community is important in that, to hold ourselves accountable. Scripture is important in that, to hold us accountable to that. I mean, that for me, those are the guardrails that we have is, community, and not just our own spirit. I do believe the Spirit speaks to us, but also the community of faith that the Spirit speaks through and out of the Word of God. So are we measuring it against that? It's tough.
I think happy is a very good translation.
I don't like happy either. I used to, but I didn't. I don't like happiness. I mean,
I think blessed is a better. My point is,
blessed is better?
blessed would be better.
Maybe. I haven't found a good one yet. I mean, I'm still looking for the right English word that captures. I mean, I think I like blessed better, and I'm pretty sure, I'm trying to remember, it's been too long since I've looked, that in my book when I'm translating, I think I go with blessed for both these and for the Psalms when they come through, because happy just doesn't, it conveys too much that I don't think is, I don't think I don't, content is not right either. Be satisfied, I don't know,
It's okay.
it's okay. It's a little more than that. I want a little more than, it's okay when people harass you. That's not quite as strong as I want, but
Don't be particularly upset.
don't be particularly upset. Poor you who are poor in spirit. Yeah, again, I think I want a little more than that. Not quite as, I think we go the wrong direction with happy, but
Don't worry about it.
don't worry about it.
Be happy.
You'll be okay. Yeah, take it easy.
You're on the right track.
I think be content is the happiest I've been. You're on the right track is good. Don't be upset. I want a little more than don't be upset. See, it needs to be a fullness of soul, but not in the emotion that conveys giddy, I think. Woohoo! People are harassing me is not the point of the story. So, Bob?
Be at peace with yourself.
Yeah, but that's not elegant, but yeah. Yeah. Like I said, I don't think there's an elegant way to translate this. So. This is one of those times where you'll get somebody who'll say, you know, this is completely untranslatable, and then go on to tell you, because it means, it's like you just translated it. It's like, what they mean is, this is not particularly elegant to translate. We don't have a good, easy way to convey that.
We're talking English too, so I don't know, maybe there's a German, maybe there's
There might be a German word. Yeah, I'm sure other languages have a much easier time with this. Or we could just leave it in Greek and teach you all to read Greek. That's always been my suggestion. God and I disagree on that, but God has Pentecost, but sure, I still think it's a better idea. Anyway, hopeless, poor in spirit. It would have been a synonymous phrase for the poor in a lot of ways. Those who have no hope. I do think it's possibly an allusion to Isaiah 61. You might remember Isaiah 61. This is what Jesus is quoting in his first sermon in Nazareth in Luke. The Lord's Spirit is upon me because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news. That's where we get the word gospel. To the poor, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim release of captives, liberation for prisoners, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, a day for vindication for our God, to comfort all who mourn. So there's some echoes in here that people hear in the Beatitudes at times, and I think that's probably not made up. I think that's probably there. I do. Because so much of Isaiah 61 that's what Jesus saw as his mission statement in Nazareth. It's not surprising to me that we would hear that in the Beatitudes as well. Yeah, Margaret?
I think it's interesting that in that one, happy are people who are hopeless because the kingdom of heaven is there.
Right.
And then it goes for any number of them, and they will be glad.
Mm-hmm.
Will be.
Present tense, future tense. Yeah.
And I think the last one is present tense as well.
It is. Kingdom of heaven is theirs when you're harassed.
Why is that?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. That's a good observation. Yeah. Yeah. They will be called, they will see, it will be, and then is theirs. Well, because in both of those contexts, we're talking about the kingdom of heaven. And in the Gospels, particularly in Mark and Matthew and Luke, the kingdom of heaven is right under your nose. That's a good translation of that. It is here among you. And so that would be my guess, is that kingdom of heaven phrases are present tense because the kingdom of heaven is present. I think both of those say kingdom of heaven, don't they? Yeah. So I think that's probably the difference. You won't necessarily see God yet. You won't necessarily be called children of God yet. You won't do these things yet, but the kingdom of heaven is here. Kingdom of heaven is at hand, many translations had, but it is right before you. It is, Mike McKeever preferred right under your nose in his translation. It's right here. Yeah. Okay, so that's the introduction. So now we're gonna speak to the disciples here and start interpreting things for folks. We're not gonna get as far as I'd hoped tonight. That's okay. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its saltiness, how will it become salty again? Boy, that's a good question. It's good for nothing, except to be thrown away and trampled under people's feet. You're the light of the world. A city on top of a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. Instead, they put it on top of a lampstand, and it shines on all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people, so they can see the good things you do and praise your Father who is in heaven. People have gone to all sorts of fun about all the ways people should be like salt, right? We can talk about flavor, we can talk about preserving, we can talk about all sorts of the features of salt, and I think any of them probably work pretty well, and I don't know that we have to pick one to think that that's what Jesus is talking about. The one confusing part is, how in the world does salt lose saltiness? Salt is a rather stable chemical thing, and it doesn't lose its saltiness much. And so some are, what's that? It doesn't. Sodium chloride is always sodium chloride. That salt will lose its saltiness? We've got Himalayan sea salt from 3,000 years ago, so I don't think that... Yeah, that salt could lose its saltiness.
And I think because it's not pure.
Oh, well, if it's not salt, then...
In some countries, they don't have
Maybe so.
pure salt.
Well, one of the things that's suggested about this text is that, around the Dead Sea, you get it. Dead Sea is 20 times saltier than the ocean. Okay, and so you get these salt formations as they crystallize on the coastline part of it. But you also not only have the salt formations that you could use as salt, it also will form some gypsum formations that look like salt, but have no saltiness to them at all. And so some suggest that that's an illustration of that they're thinking of the things that are like salt but aren't really salt, that aren't worth anything, which is possible. Although it's funny, I did see this person had a Himalayan sea salt from 3,000 years old, and it expired next March. And he goes, man, whew, just under the wire that I got this. I got the 3,000-year-old Himalayan sea salt that's going to expire in 3 months. I better use it. Anyway.
I have consulted Copilot if you care.
Oh, does salt lose its saltiness?
Properly stored in a dry, cool place, salt should retain its flavor indefinitely.
Ah,
However, if salt is exposed to moisture, impurities, or contaminants, it can absorb those elements and develop off flavors.
oh, salt can develop off flavors if stored improperly. So maybe that's what we're referring to. If AI can be trusted. So.
I think what you have is you have another biblical text
Yes.
that has just been proven to be correct.
Okay. Sure. This is not one I would have been fighting over to be correct. I probably think love your enemies is one we should be fighting over to be correct. But yeah, I'm sure. I'll give you this one. I'll give you. I'll give you this one. Sure. We do have this, praise your Father who's in heaven. Now this is interesting because Mark, I believe, mentions God as Father one time. Matthew mentions God as Father 45 times. And over half of those are your Father who is in heaven. And that is a really cool phrase to me in the way that he's pulling this out, because first of all, we've talked before, right? The image of father in the first century Roman Empire, not necessarily a positive one. This is one, the emperor considered himself the paterfamilias, the head of the father of the Roman Empire. The paterfamilia was the emperor of his own home. You could be abusive and cruel, and I mean, nobody really had particularly warm and cozy notions about father. And Jesus in Mark does sort of subtly undermine that, because you'll come to the kingdom of heaven and get a new mother and brother and sisters. He never mentions father in that, so you see him start to sort of undermine that. Matthew makes it explicit, right? Your Father who is in heaven. So I think it's fascinating, rather than abandon the metaphor or go for a different metaphor, Matthew is redeeming this word, right? A word like justice that's used so much that may not have meaning anymore. Matthew's doubling down. No. God is Father. God is our Father who is in heaven. And in that little phrase, our Father who is in heaven, managed to capture both an imminent and close relationship, our Father, and the transcendent relationship who is in heaven, in that God is both near to us, close to us, relational to us, and transcendent over all and above all, which I just find really cool, just in that simple phrase that we use it so much we don't even think about it. But this is the first gospel to really put that together and talk about our Father who is in heaven. And it's just, to me, a beautiful image that we have there.
So the father figure was allowed to get away with stuff because they had the power.
Correct.
They were in control.
Correct. The Father could get away because they were the boss.
In control.
Mm-hmm. Only what we're about to see is our powerful, in control Father in heaven subverts all of that in the rest of this. And the rain falls on the just and the unjust. And you do these things because you're going to be like our Father in heaven. You're going to love your enemy. You're going to offer grace. You're going to be generous. You're going to forgive, because that's what God does, which is not at all what our fathers on earth would be like.
Because they abuse their power.
Correct. They're abusing power. And that, from the very beginning of the Bible, power is evaluated by how well you're using it for others. If you're using power and position to feed self, You are a bad king. It's a bad use of wealth. It's just a bad use of position. The king is supposed to read the Torah every day. The king is supposed to read a Torah that they copied every day. So, I mean, it is somewhat ambiguous in Deuteronomy 17, but it seems that the king is supposed to have made a copy themselves of the Torah that they then read every day to remember that their position is not one of absolute power. Their position is to use this position for the people and for God's people, to bring about God's Torah, right? And so absolutely, that this misuse of power is what is just characteristic of fathers here, and God is coming along and subverting that as we go. 100%, yeah.
It's really hard for people who have bad fathers
Yes,
to
absolutely.
have positive.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that I ran up against often when teaching, is that individuals who have had poor fathers, rather than seeing this as a redemption of that metaphor, see it as a continuation of it. And that God is the same bullying, misogynistic person with anger management issues that this person dealt with growing up. So rather than seeing God as a contrast, they experience themselves religious trauma as a result of this. And I spent a lot of time trying to redeem that as we talk about that and understanding these images and these metaphors and the limits of them. You know, God is both like our human fathers, but unlike our human fathers. God is both like a shepherd, but unlike a shepherd. God is both king, but unlike a king. So, yeah, the limits of metaphor and the challenges here. I have to confess that I cannot see this passage without being reminded of my Hebrew class, because one of the challenges I had when I took Hebrew was telling the difference between the word ear and the word or, which don't look anything alike, but you can ear and or in Hebrew. No, in this case, it's just, that's the Hebrew word ear, which means city, and the word or, which means light. They don't look alike. They're spelled with completely different letters. They're both three-letter words. They're both spelled completely differently. But I think in my mind, because of the similarity of the sound, ear and or, I always confuse them, right? I kept translating light as city. I kept translating city as light, till finally, one day, I'd done it so much on tests and quizzes and readings that Dr. Laird, we got to a passage and it had the word light in it, and Dr. Laird said, no, wait, I want Robert to do this one. And I realized why he wanted me to do it, and I got it right, and my best friend sitting next to me starts teasing me about getting it wrong and said, who puts a city under a bushel? And a lampstand on a hill can't be hidden. It's like, would you stop it? Just reversing the words in this passage. Because I screwed that up. I do fine now, by the way. I get them both pretty well, but 30 years ago I struggled with that. I'm just gonna be honest. So, yeah. Well, we got 16 verses in, and I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the sermon, and then we'll pick up right here next week. Simeon the Just was a 3rd century Jewish, 3rd century BC Jewish individual who once said the world is sustained through these 3 things: the Torah, temple service, and acts of loving kindness. This was 300 years before Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount that he said this, and 300 years before Matthew's putting the gospel together. And it does seem that the Sermon on the Mount is put together around these 3 pillars, because chapter 5 gives us a reinterpretation of the law. Chapter 6 gives us an understanding of what true service is: prayer, fasting, offerings. What does those acts of religious worship service look like? And the last one is our responsibilities to one another, the judgments we have, etc. And so I do think that it's not by accident that it's arranged in this way. Now, it happens by accident that it comes up so neatly along the chapter divisions, because the chapter divisions are just accidental in so many ways. Tradition says the 13th century French monk that gave us our New Testament verse divisions was riding on horseback with a pen, and everywhere his pen hit the manuscript, that's where a new verse started. In the Old Testament, there's actual reason for it, but in the New Testament, there's no reason whatsoever for why one verse starts here and one chapter starts here. So this breakdown is accidental, but I think this organization is absolutely intentional, because I think that that's how they thought about what true and good service is to God. Torah, worship, and and kindness to one another as we go through it. So we'll pick up there next week and the antitheses next week. So that'll be good. Any final thoughts, questions before we go? Yes, ma'am?
I'm reading an excellent book.
Martha's reading an excellent book called A New Look at Rabbi Jesus. What was the name of the author again? I've forgotten his name.
Rabbi Albert Abraham I. Slomovitz.
New Look at Rabbi Jesus. You can find the author online. But it is approaching. There are several individuals who will break down the Jewishness of Jesus. A couple people do it better than others. They always use Matthew because it was a Jewish gospel. It was written for Jewish Christians, and so it leans. You don't see anybody using Luke to talk about the Jewishness of Jesus. It's always Matthew. I looked up this individual when Martha showed it to me. He seems to be a very good scholar, and I haven't read the book, but seem to be able to commend. If you're interested in this, Amy Jill Levine, who's also a Jewish New Testament scholar, does an excellent job of this as well, breaking it down. She's got one called, and the name just fell out of my head. Anyway, she's done the same kind of work, talking about the Jewishness of Jesus, and does excellent work as well. So also using the book of Matthew, because that's what you got to do. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he says, I'm not trying to convert anybody.
Right.
That we both need to understand each other more.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you they do a partnership
Mm-hmm.
where they study, and people say, oh, I didn't hear it that way.
Right.
To me, that meant
Right.
this. And you say, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way, but
Right.
I was thinking about it this way. And this is the way they
We're going to talk about an exact example of that next time. When next time we come together, we will have an exact example of how a Jewish hearer can hear the same verse differently than we Gentiles will hear it as we go. But most of the time, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that Jesus was Jewish. That shouldn't be shocking, and that because Jesus was Jewish, sometimes looks Jewish. I mean, who would have thought? The things he does and says. I mean, I'll be darned. So shouldn't come as a surprise. We'll highlight it when we can. So, well, have a great week.